Hello guys, so today I would like to look a little bit at Vray rendering engine inside of Maya. In fact, I would like to do maybe a few different lessons about this, about creating things like materials, looking at the different properties of the materials and the rendering engine itself. So let's start with the real basics, which is simply setting up Vray. Now, of course, there's a number of different render engines that you can use in Maya. I use Vray mainly for architectural work, but I actually use it for most of the things that I do in 3D. And it can be used for all kinds of things. As many rendering engines, they have advantages and disadvantages, etc. But this, for me, is one that I know relatively well and I'm relatively comfortable with. So I want to pass on some of this information. Now, the information I'm giving you might not be completely up to date. I've been using Vray for quite some time, and because of that, some of the ideas or information I give you might be a bit outdated compared to the information for the most recent version. Feel happy to point that out in the comments and correct me on things. I'm open to anything that you guys have to input to. I'm not a closed book in this way. But anyway, let's move forward very quickly. So what I basically want to do first of all is just look at, if you've never used Vray before, how do I even set it up to even be able to use it? If you go into your render settings, which is this button here with a little kind of cog wheel on it, and open up those render settings, when you first open Maya, you'll see that you got Maya software, Maya hardware, and Maya hardware 2.0, and that's it. So where the hell is Vray basically? Well, I've already installed Vray, and if you have a copy of Vray, I'm not sure for all copies, but for mine I have a little dongle that goes, a USB dongle, which I put in the computer, which is used for the license activation. Once I've got all of that set up, and I'm not going to reinstall it on here to show you that, that's quite easy to do, and Chaos Group, the company that make Vray, will send you that information of how to do that. But once you've got all of that up and running, all you need to do when you open Maya is, of course, you'll think, okay, it's still not here. You simply go into your plugins. So if you go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager, and open this up. And in here, you'll see all the plugins that are available for Maya. And they're put in various locations, and the locations you can see here. So this one is, of course, in the Applications, Autodesk, Maya 2016, etc., right? And then you've got some different plugins, and they'll put them in different locations. And the one that I'm actually going to look for this is the one about Vray. Now, where is that? Here we go. Applications, Autodesk, and Maya 2016 Vray plugins. And here I can see Maya for Vray bundle and the XGen Vray. I don't actually use this XGen Vray. Sometimes I enable it. I don't know why. Probably don't really need to. And what this plugin manager allows you to do, it allows you to just turn on the plugins that you actually need to use. Now, the benefit of this is that, of course, Maya will load quicker, it's using less RAM and stuff like this, so it's always better just to kind of use the stuff that you're actually going to need. So let's turn on this anyway, this Vray for Maya bundle. Give it a second to fire up. If I put auto load, click this on, this means that every time I restart Maya, Vray will be in the list. I found this autoload to be a little bit buggy, and sometimes it doesn't reload and I have to go back into here again and reactivate it. But generally speaking, it will pop up again. Okay, so go to here, close. Now if I go to the render settings, I open here, I should see Vray. Okay, that opens up, and then I've got a bunch of different windows here. Common, I've got the Vray, GI stands for Global Illumination, the settings, some overrides, render elements, and some IPR here. Okay, so I think the way to demonstrate this is just to, first of all, create some kind of basic scene, just a few basic primitives. Let me just start by checking the actual the units of this scene right now. So we've got going to settings. So we're set up in centimeters, and the grid, I'm not sure how much that represents. Let me just see. Okay, so it's set to 20 units. There's a grid line every 100 units, but we're in subdivisions of 100, which must mean that each square that we've got here is actually just 1 centimeter. Let me just try and demonstrate that. If I make that to maybe 220 units, I should see the yellow lines appear. Okay, yeah, we do. So the yellow line, of course, is going to be 1 meter. So we probably can go back to the 20 centimeters here. Okay, so from one side right to the other, it's only going to be 40 centimeters. It's pretty small, but that's okay. We can just build a small scene around this. I'm sorry if I kind of pause a little bit, you know, when I'm doing something. I kind of struggle a little bit to search for something on the screen and at the same time talk about it. It's a little kind of strange for me. Maybe this tiny brain isn't really activated so well today. Okay, so let's start by going into our create menu, polygon primitives, and I'll just start making a plane. And I want this plane to probably go over most of this grid here. It's slightly, let me just, one moment, connect. Make this slightly bigger. Alrighty. It doesn't really matter about getting the this setup just correctly with UVs. If you're familiar with UV mapping and things like that, I'm just going to use very basic shaders at the moment, so there's going to be no textures applied or anything like that. So at the moment UVs are not really important. I'll also maybe make a sphere. Let's just put a sphere in there. Okay, maybe we should make that a bit bigger, I think. Okay, let's scale that up, and I'll sit that on the plane. Let's also make a cube. Alright. And maybe with this cube, I might actually bevel it a little bit. So let's put a bevel on that. And I'll just change the bevel settings. If you're not familiar with bevel, you can simply add these bevels, and you'll find it in this menu here, edit mesh and bevel. I've made a shelf tool for it, but they do exactly the same thing. And then inside of here you can change the offset. Actually no, not the offset, it must be the fraction. There we go. Okay, and I'm going to add a few more segments to that, probably just one more actually. Okay, so it just gives it a bit of a smoother edge. I might just sharpen that up just slightly. Okay, maybe not actually. Let's go back to where we were with that. All right, and what else should I put in here? I'll put in a cone as well, I think. All right, and let's see what I can adjust here. Subdivision, subdivision height, maybe this radius. Let's bring that down a bit. Okay. All right, cool. Okay, next thing, I just want to create a basic light for this scene. So let's just add a light in here, and I'll probably use a maybe a Vray rectangular light I'll use. Let me just move this into a better position. Oops. Let's just spin this around here. Go into its settings. I'm just going to make this a bit bigger. Don't worry about these settings for now. I will explain them all in another video. Today I just want to set up a basic scene. Let me see if we're getting anything yet. Alright, okay, so I might turn this bit off here. The options. Okay, let's try that. Okay, so I'm just getting rid of that light there. So let me go in and explain what's happening here. I've just made these three basic primitives, in fact 4 if we include the plane as well. And then there's an area light that I've added there. That area light is simply pointing in this direction, of course. However, the materials that we're using on here, what materials could they be? Well, there's something called the Hypershade. I've set up a hotkey for that, but if you're looking for it, you go into Windows, and then you go, where's it going to be? Just give me 1 second to find this. Relationship rendering editors will be here. Okay, Hypershade. I've set up a hotkey for that, which was Command-Shift-H. But of course, you can set it up to whatever hotkey you want, or simply use the menu there to find it. And this basically is your material editor. If you're using 3D Studio Max or something like that, you'll know this as the material editor when you hit the M key. But in Maya, it's called the Hypershade, and it's basically the same thing. So up here in the top part, we have the bin, which is where you keep all of your materials and all of their different swatches for that. You can change the size of them by clicking on these buttons just here, so you can maybe see them a little bit better. I found that it isn't always so great, these swatches. Sometimes they don't seem to update correctly or look quite right, like they would look on the actual geometry, but at least it gives you a bit of a preview to see what they look like. You can remove the swatches completely if you want and just use text instead. I tend to keep these on though. What else can I tell you about this? We've got the materials here. These are where you'll put your textures. If you add textures to these shaders, there's various utilities, and there's actually nothing in the scene right now much that I can show you. But as you start to build your scene, in particular if you do architectural work, you'll find that sometimes you'll have hundreds of materials in here. I know I do, and it can get very complicated after some time. So my advice is always name everything correctly too, so it's easy to find. Okay, now if I'll just pop this down a minute. So let me just open this this sphere, and I want to know, okay, what information is on there? What material do I actually have on here? And what I can do is if I go into this little button here and click this, it will actually show me what I've got on here. It doesn't put up a little tooltip there, I've noticed. I don't know if the other ones do either. No, but okay, but this button here basically takes the material or the shader that's attached to that geometry, and it will pop it into this window here where I can edit it. Now this at first looks pretty scary, right? Because you've got these things called nodes, and these nodes all have inputs and outputs, and every node is different, and at first it can look extremely complicated, especially as you build up these node trees as they're called. However, once you break it down, once you practice it quite a bit and get used to it, you know what, it starts to seem pretty simple. And now I don't really think about it all too much, especially with the nodes that I'm very familiar with. Now this material that was added here is called a Lambert, and this Lambert material is a material that actually comes with a Maya itself. Now as you can see here, I've got a list of different materials that can be added, or different shaders that can be added. And if you go into the Maya section here on the left and open the surfaces, is it going to select the various ones for me? Okay, it's also put the Vray ones in there, but if you don't have Vray installed, you would just see these ones here at the bottom, which is the Fong and the Blinn and the Lambert. I actually found out the other day that the Blinn material was actually written by a guy called Jim Blinn, and that's why it's called a Blinn, and I think he just produced the mathematics behind it, I assume. And then of course you've got the Vray materials here. I generally don't touch the surface materials from Maya only when I'm working in Vray. You can, as you saw it rendered there, but the Vray materials that were made specifically by Chaos Group are much more physically accurate, so I would always recommend, if you're using Vray, to use their own shaders. So these ones here, for these few here that you see, I probably wouldn't use these much. Maybe I would use a surface shader in some cases, but generally speaking, I'm going to just stick with these ones here. So if you go into the V-Ray list here and you can see the V-Ray surface shaders, I'll probably just be using these ones. Now, this one here, this Lambert, actually belongs, if I go to the list here, you can see this Lambert actually belongs to these guys here that come with Maya. So I'm going to throw this one away and I'm going to instead use a V-Ray material instead. So let's get rid of this. I don't really, in fact, I don't think I can delete this one because it's the base material that's in Maya, but all I'll do is I'll create a new one. So if I hit this button here, it'll clear the graph, okay? And then all I will do is select the material that I want. Let's take the most basic material, which is the V-Ray material. Now I'm not going to go into this too much today. The material, the V-Ray material, can be, while it looks kind of basic at the beginning, it can get very complicated, and I'll go into it in more detail over probably a few lessons. But just to explain it very simply right now, this is of course the V-Ray standard material. Most of my materials will be based off these. The other ones I tend to use for more specialist situations. But this one here is the one that I'll use for probably 90% of the work that I do, maybe even more. And if you look here on the right, you'll see that this node's parameters. Now, this here is the main node. This here is called the shader group. And when you link these here to these nodes here, it will automatically connect to this shader group. It sounds a bit weird, a bit complicated how it works, and I can show you later in the hypergraph maybe. However, I'll just kind of give you the information that you probably need to know right now, and that is that this material will become attached here. So how will I do that? Well, let's quickly attach it and then we'll go into the parameters later. So I'm going to just close this down a little bit, make this a little bit smaller so I can see what's going on. And all I will do is, if I want this, I've got a few ways I can do this. I can select this, I can then middle click over to the material that I want and add it. And maybe to make that obvious what's happened there, I'll just change the color a little bit. Let's go to maybe make it red. Okay, and I should also add, if you hit 6 on your keyboard, you'll also see the shaders come into the viewport. Okay, so 5, one moment, 5 will make it into grayscale. Of course, you've got 4 wireframe, 5 is the grayscale, and then 6 will add the materials onto it so you can see them easily. So all I did there, I middle mouse clicked, I dragged, and I dropped it. Another way that you can do it is that you can just select the material that you want. Then you can right click and move up to assign material to viewport selection, and boom, there you go. All right, so you've got 2 options there. You can either middle click and drag it on, or you can select the material that you want and you can right click and just assign material to viewport selection. You can of course select multiple things as well. You don't need to just have one, of course. Now let me just select these other 2. I'll do the same thing and I'll make the whole thing red, right? Now if I decide to change the color, it takes up a lot of space. It used to be a lot smaller in past versions, and then they made it a much bigger pane. Now it sounds like a pain actually to use it because I'm all the time having to kind of switch between screens here, but in reality in my working day I have 3 monitors, and I will just simply put this Hypershade on the left. I've got the viewport in the middle, and actually I'll put the renderer on the right screen. And so I'm not really flicking between screens at all. I'm using all 3 screens to full effect, just to create the 3D that I need. But I find 3 works well. Some guys work with 2. Some guys may work with more than 3. I don't know. I've never seen that before, but I guess it is certainly possible. So anyway, back to the materials. So we've got what's called the diffuse here, the basic parameters, and there's a diffuse color, which is just the main color of the material. And of course I can just change that color to whatever color I want. I can use the HSV, which is hue, saturation, and value, to change that if I want. The saturation is here, of course, and the value is the brightness. I can also do this in RGB as well if I want, between values of 1 to 0 or 0 to 255, depending on what I need and what information I have. I tend to use HSV most of the time, but there might be sometimes if I have very specific colors and I've already got all of the RGB numbers for that, I might use this to be very specific with that, especially if it's a type of paint color or something like this. But generally speaking, I just use the HSV. Okay, next thing here, I've got the amount. I tend not to use that at all. That just controls the amount of color that's in there. I've never actually moved that before, so I would just keep that at 1, and I just select the color from here. The opacity map, that just controls the transparency of the image, and you can see here, let me make that a little bigger. You can see here how it has this kind of checkerboard over it. That checkerboard is just showing you where that transparency is. So in this case, the transparency is all over the material, and of course, as I decrease that, now it's fully transparent. I can't see anything, and here, of course, it's fully opaque. So if I see this checkerboard over it just a little bit, and here's me again pointing to the screen like you can see me, if I look at this checkerboard here, I can see there must be some transparency on that there. Now it can also add a map into here. In some cases, say I've got a leaf or something like that, I might want the edges, around the edges, all to be transparent, and I can add an opacity map there, which will make the pieces that I want transparent and the pieces I want opaque, but that's another lesson. Okay, the roughness just adds a kind of roughness to the material. As you can see, it's taken away some of the kind of reflections, and then those kind of reflections come back again here. Self-illumination is all really about can it light itself, and it's creating some kind of light within it. I tend not to use this self-illumination so much. There are better ways to do it with different materials, but you may find that helpful to you. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of these because it'll take me too long, but when it comes to reflection, you have BRDF type and you've got the different types. They used to just be Phong, the Blinn, and the Ward. And generally speaking, you would use the Phong for plastics and maybe the Blinn for plastics. The Ward would be used for metals. And what it is, it's just a different way that the reflection, or rather the specular highlight on that material reacts or spreads out. So let me give you an example maybe. So if I put on some reflection here, just turn on reflection, no need to really know too much about what I'm doing here. I'm just going to put some glossiness there. Now you can see that there's this little highlight here. That's called a specular highlight, okay? And it's usually where the light source, the main light source, is reflected back from on that material. Now on a Ward material, that will spread out a little more. It tends to be used for metals, and if you look at metals, that highlight will not be as concentrated. It tends to be spread out more, and there'll be more fall off coming off that. In a plastic material, a more shiny material, that highlight will probably be a bit smaller, a bit tighter, and maybe even appear to be a bit brighter. Technically, I guess it's not brighter, but it will look that way. Okay. So if I hit that around to bling, you can see how that highlight has suddenly got a lot sharper. Let me see, have I got an opacity on here? No, it's just, okay, so this little checkerboard that you can see over here, it's not this big checkerboard, it's just a small one, and that's just trying to show that there's some reflection on that. So it's not transparency this time, this is reflection. The difference being that if I turn up this opacity map, you see how it's got the big checkerboard here. It's got the big squares. I fill that right up. You can see it's just got these wee small squares and they change in direction. That's just to show that there's some reflection on there. That's all that is. However, what's important here is that this bling and this Phong actually now I never use. Recently, well, I'd say maybe a year or so ago, Vray introduced this Ggx material, which I find is a lot better for most materials, and nearly all of my reflections I will use the Ggx. The only occasion where I may not would be that I might use the Ward for some metals, like I said, but most materials now I'll just use this Ggx material. It tends to be a little bit more accurate. Okay, going down, if I put this here, you can see I've got this full reflection, right? But if I was to knock this down a bit, I can see this highlight appears. The reason the highlight appears is because you're creating some kind of blurriness, I guess, of the reflection itself. So think of a mirror. A mirror would be with full glossy, so it'd be one gloss, right? One unit, and that would be like a mirror. But if you had something like a maybe a chrome or something like that too, but if that material starts to get more spread, so maybe like a plastic or something, you'll see that as you reduce this glossiness, you see how the specular highlight starts to spread out and it starts to look less shiny. That's due to the glossiness. Be careful though, you don't want to go too low with this. A lot of people might drop this right down. You're going to increase render times a lot, because it's much more difficult for the V-Ray render engine to be able to render the glossy materials. And the more glossy it gets, or rather the more blurred that image gets or that material gets, it's going to take longer. And of course the mirror won't take so long. Actually, it's the more diffuse materials that tend to take longer. Reflection subdivision, that's a whole nasty subject, but it's all to do again with reducing noise usually from an image, especially once you add this glossiness, you tend to introduce noise into it too, and this can help remove it. In general, I tend not to change this so much now. I used to a lot, but the way that the V-Ray render engine has improved a lot over the last couple of years, I tend not to change this so much unless I absolutely have to. Fresnel, it's pronounced Fresnel, I believe. This is connected to, if I was to turn this off, for example, and you can see this here, that would be a full mirror. This allows some of the color to show through. I would have to show you a demonstration of how Fresnel works and some examples of that, so I'll show that another time. But basically, most of the time the materials we make, we won't have this turned on. If you want to make a quick material, turn this on. However, I'll show you how to make your own Fresnel curves for different materials that will be probably a bit more accurate. Okay, let's move on down a little bit. I won't touch this or the advanced settings for now, don't touch them. The refraction is connected to when something is like glass or water, basically something which is see-through and has some sense of refraction. And these are the settings for that right here. Subsurface scattering we won't touch on at the moment. That's used for things like candle wax, skin, things like this. And also we've got the bump map here, which will create a kind of a bumpy appearance on the material. But all of them is all for another day. Lucky for you, you don't have to endure that. So let's quickly create some different materials for this this scene right now, our very interesting scene. Of course, I'm sure you'll say that this is Hollywood quality right now. So let's select the base first of all, and I'm going to clear this a moment. And all I'm going to do here is put a plain grey material on here. I don't need to do any more than that. I don't want it to be reflective in any way, so the reflection, everything is turned off, and it's just your basic material there. And we'll just call this grey matte. By the way, grey is G-R-E-Y or A-Y. I never remember. I think one is American English and one is British English. I think this is the British English version, although I'm not sure. So you British and American guys can fight that one out. Actually, I love that kind of fight. It's all good stuff. Okay, so that's that one there done. That didn't update. That should have updated the text here and didn't, but never mind. It's no big deal. Let's delete that. We'll probably keep this green material on the sphere here. All right, so green, and I'm putting VR there. I usually put VR afterwards just to say that it's a V-Ray material. It's really up to you how you decide to code these. Let's create another one here. So let's have a another standard material, and I'm going to add that to here, and maybe we'll make this one blue. Just get a bluey kind of color. All right. Wait a minute, what did I do there? I've made a bit of a mistake. I didn't change over. There we go. All right, so blue VR. Now we're all good. I'm really not sure why that's not updating. It usually does, but it's having a little bit of a tantrum today. I'll have to have a word with Autodesk about that. Never mind. I'm sure if I restart, it'll suddenly start working again. And we've got one more. Let's just clear that up. In fact, you can put more than one material on here if you want. So let's do that. And let's just maybe make this one maybe a yellow or something. Maybe not yellow. Let's go with maybe brown instead. Okay. And I think a darkish brown. Okay. All right. Sound like an American there, right? All right. All right. So, and the next thing to do is to take a quick render of that. So I'm going to push this off to the sides. You can't see it, but I can. It's there, trust me. And then if you want to do a render, you just hit the render button, which is here. Or you can set up a hotkey for it, which I did, which I set up Command R on the Mac. You can set up Control R if you're on the PC. So I'll hit the render anyway, and we'll see what we get. Okay, so first of all, you can see that we've got a blue material, a brown material, a grey material, and we've got some shadows, there's a bit of noise in there. And we've got this reflection going on here, which is of course seeing the light, which is over here somewhere. And these materials here don't have any reflection on, so that's why you can't see anything much happening there. But let me go into the settings themselves and try to explain a little bit about what's going on. Now this is where the whole world becomes a little bit painful. It looks quite horrible the first time you look at this stuff. But my advice would be, I'm not going to go through everything. There are some guys that explain everything and they do a great job at that. I probably couldn't do a great job at explaining it. I will explain the things that I use, but what I tend to do is set up a bunch of presets. So when I've got some settings that I think work for me, I tend to save them, these presets, into here, and then I just reuse them over and over again, or maybe tweak them a little bit when necessary. So first of all, I've got the common palette, and every render engine will have the same. If you go into the Maya software, it will have the same thing. And all this does, it tells you where you're going to save your images, especially if you're doing what's called a batch render for animation or something like this. It will save them to a specific location, maybe. In fact, I say maybe, it will. You've also got this animation thing here. It's disabled at the moment, but if I open it, I can specify what frames I want to render, etc, etc. But I'll disable that for now because I'm just doing a still frame. We've got the renderable camera, which in this case is the perspective camera. I can select which camera I want. I didn't create any additional cameras, so I've just got the perspective camera in there. We've also got the resolution. Now, of course, this bit's quite important. At the moment, it's set to 800 by 565. I'm not sure if I can. Oh yes, of course, I can see it here, 100%, and it gives me the resolution here, and that's of course the size of the screen here, right? Here I'm telling it to use V-Ray, and it's all pretty basic stuff there, right? So that part's quite easy. Now don't worry if there's anything here that I'm going maybe past too quickly and you're thinking, whoa, what happened there? He didn't explain this, he didn't explain that. Don't worry, I'll come back to it many times in future lessons. You're going to go over this thing 100 times, so don't be so worried if you miss everything right now. So let's go over to the Vray palette. Here I've got the production engine. You might want to use the OpenCL or CUDA. Depends on if you're using a GPU, which is your graphics card to render, or your CPU. I'm using a Mac, so I'm using a CPU. It doesn't work too well with the graphics card at the moment, I believe. But I think that PC users often are using this GPU rendering right now, and it's supposed to be pretty quick, which is certainly nice. Okay, I've got the image sampler here, which tells me is it going to do it in buckets or progressive. Let me explain what that is. If I do another render, okay, just let it do this a moment. There you can see these little white dots. It was pretty quick there. I've got quite a fast CPU, but you can see these little white dots. They're little buckets, right? That's a bucket render. A progressive render is slightly different. It'll just create lots of little dots, and over time they will improve and become clearer and clearer, right? The bucket will just fill the bucket and move on to the next bucket. It's a done job. Most of the time I tend to use bucket render. I rarely use this progressive render, but you can play around with that too if you want to. The filter type, there's all different kind of filter types, which is to do with your sampling. Your AA stands for anti-aliasing. Anti-aliasing really involves the marks around the edges here. Okay, that's your anti-aliasing. If you ever do 2D graphic design, and you'll see the anti-aliasing around text, and it kind of blurs the edges of the text a little bit to make it look a bit more pleasant, and takes away some of those kind of harsh, sharp edges. Well, that's what it does in 3D as well, and it can be a real pain in the backside actually to get that right sometimes. But this is just different kind of filter types. I like this one, the Catmull Rum, I suppose it's called, but you can play around with different types in there as well. This is a whole world of pain, this part here, to do with your subdivisions with the buckets, which I'll explain a bit later. Then I've got my Dmc Sampler. It's got a pretty low sample rate at the moment due to just making a draft, but again I'll explain that soon as well. And then I've got my color mapping, which is all to do with how these colors are represented on the screen. And did I put the advanced part in? And the advanced, I always have this subpixel mapping turned on. Some people don't like to have it on. It's not physically accurate to have that on, but it does take away some of these nasty highlights which tend to pop up sometimes. If I turn that on, it turns them off, right? Okay, this is quite complicated, isn't it? Okay, so let's go into the GI, which is the global illumination. I'm going to turn that off for now. Actually, let me just turn that off and see what we get. Okay, you see it went a little dark there. Let me turn that off for now. We don't need to use that right now, the GI. Okay, let's look at these settings a moment. There's one important one here, which is under System. I've got dynamic memory limit. And this dynamic memory limit is to do with how much RAM you're going to give to the render engine and to Maya. Your computer's RAM will fill up pretty quickly sometimes, and so you'll need to have a fair amount of RAM. If I go into my computer settings, it should show up here, and I go into memory, you can see here I've got 32 gigabytes installed. I could put another 32 in there quite comfortably, make it 64. Haven't needed to yet, but if you're just using maybe 8 or 16 gig of memory, you might get to a point with some more complicated renders where you might feel like you need to upgrade that RAM a little bit. Now here, I think by default it's maybe only set to about 8 gig or something, I'm not certain, but you might find that that's not enough, and the computer starts to choke, or certainly Maya will start to choke if you don't have enough memory added there. So make sure that you have enough there. I would always put in maybe at least 70% of my RAM I will put into that, especially if I'm doing some larger renders. Okay, my overrides, these are kind of cool. Here I can decide, especially the materials one I will use sometimes, where I can decide to turn off the reflections and refractions of materials. Let me see if that does there. You see they've disappeared. And it's really just a temporary measure while I'm testing stuff, and I can put them back on. There's one thing which I have a little bit of a gripe with this, and that is that the 3D Studio Max guys, they have an override material one which will just allow you to put a standard material and override everything in the scene, which is really cool for setting up lights. And Maya doesn't have that little function there, which would be cool. So I have to go in the material editor and change every material individually, which can be a real pain in the backside. But that's the only gripe I really have with that. Otherwise, from that, it's a pretty nice feature, of course. Here I can add my environment if I want to add a sun and a sky to that, and I'll show you how to do that in future lessons. And here is the render elements. Now the render elements are pretty cool for a number of reasons. What it basically does is it takes certain parts of your image and puts them into its own separate image, its own map. And it's cool for things like diagnosing. If I want to know where is the noise in my image, I've got this terrible noise in my image and I don't know where it's coming from. It's also great for post-production as well, and you'll find later that when you render images, you want to take them probably into Photoshop or into Foundry's Nuke or something like this, and you will put these things back together and it will give you a certain amount of control over the individual reflections and colors and all these cool things like this, right? So I tend to use these quite a lot. At the moment we don't have any setup. If I go here, I've just got my alpha channel and I've got my RGB channel, that's it. But let's set up a few now and let's do that. So I'm going to knock that back a bit. In fact, I will move the camera in closer. And a good way to check if the camera is in the right position, if I go here, which one is it going to be here, the resolution gate, and this area here is where the camera will cut off. Okay, so I'm just going to move in the camera a bit closer. Take another render, it should be a bit closer now. Okay, it's still a bit dark there, but the part of that is that we don't have the GI on. Maybe if I add the GI, just turn it around a bit, and I'm going to turn on the global illumination here, see if that brightens up the back end of it a bit. Okay, again, I don't want to get too much into the GI right now, that's a whole other lesson, but let's go into these render elements. So in the render elements, I'm going to set up a diffuse channel, so you can see what that looks like. I'm going to set up a GI channel. Actually, there won't be much in there right now. Oh yeah, there is. I just turned it on. There should be. I'm going to set up a lighting channel. What else do I want to set up? I also want to set up reflections, and I'm going to also use the sample rate in here too. Okay, cool. And then we'll take another render and see what we have. Okay, it's pretty quick. Now, at first it looks exactly the same. Reason is it is exactly the same. However, when I go into here, I can choose my alpha. I can also choose the diffuse, and this is just the color. That's all I'm getting here in this channel is just color. So I can see exactly what those colors are. Reason being that if you have some strong reflections on there, it might be hard to diagnose what colors actually hiding under there exactly, and this will help you. You can also use it for some post-production things as well later on, which I found helpful. Your GI, and the GI, okay, I'll explain what that is. It's basically your secondary bounce light, and I would have to draw some diagrams to explain this, but try to imagine you've got direct sunlight coming through your window, right? And it has kind of a specular highlight. You can see maybe on some of the images from the outside source light, and you can see a hot spot on the wall from the sun. Well, this is going to be direct light, and that will be this one here. So the direct light source, and this is exactly where it's hitting, right? And then these parts in shadow are almost jet black. In fact, it might even be jet black right in there, right? Now the GI is the bounce light. So imagine that the sun isn't coming through that window. Imagine it's shooting the other direction. Where I am in Australia, I've got a north-facing house. So imagine I'm in the room. In fact, I am in the room right at the back of the house right now, which is the south-facing. And so I tend not to get any direct sunlight into this room. However, it's still lit, the room, right? And the reason is due to GI. It's due to secondary bounce light. The light hits another item or a wall or hits something and bounces off and creates more light and loses intensity each time. Okay, so this stuff here is the stuff that's bounced around. It's coming from the light source and then it's bouncing around all over the place. And you're also getting some, I think it's called a radiance that comes off here, which is where the color also bounces off with it, which you can also change inside of V-Ray. So that's what that is, right? Now, when you see these GI and you see the lighting, they get mixed together and they create this, right? But we've also got the reflection, and you can see there's only one material that has reflection and quite a sharp reflection at that. Let's look at that reflection one moment. We talked about this before. I'll go back to my material editor. Where are we? Here we go. All right, I'm just popping that up a moment. And remember I talked about this glossiness. Now remember we said if I reduce this glossy, look what's happening. I'm getting this kind of diffuse kind of specular here. Let's look what happens here when I try to render this. I'll go back to this a moment and you can see what happens to this sharpness here. See how it's starting to break apart with the blurriness, right? And of course, the more that I diffuse that, more I reduce this reflection glossiness, the more it starts to change and maybe look even like a different material altogether, you see. Now if I go into my reflections, I can see here that it's much more spread out. However, look at the noise. It's also creating a lot of noise in there, and that can be really problematic later on. And you can counteract that by using subdivisions, which are basically samples. Now, if I go into my sample rate, this gives me a little bit of information here too. It generally affects your anti-aliasing, but you can also see it sometimes over the textures. And what it does is blue tells you there's not many samples, and red tells you there's maximum samples. If I go into my V-Ray settings again, I can see my maximum subdivision samples are 8, which means that it's gone over this part of the render 8 times to try to get the best quality that it can, right? Generally speaking, this would be a pretty good sample pass to an extent, because you want really the edges to be probably at their maximum there, because these are the anti-aliasing parts. You see how they start to look a bit kind of blocky and sharp. Now the less anti-aliasing that you have on that, the more blocky they become. So to try and smooth them off, you add more samples to them, right? But sometimes you can look at this sample pass and you could have red all over the place and bits of green all over the place. You know, you're spitting out too many samples into the scene. And what does that mean? It generally means you're going to have higher render times. Okay, so but you've got to find this balance. Now this image here is not a good quality image. I've got a draft render of this right now, and if I was to make a more high quality render, of course a lot of this noise here that you can see here would be reduced. In fact, let's try that now. I'm going to just change some of my settings. I'll make this 1 here. I might improve this 12. Don't worry too much about what I'm doing at the moment, and let me just go into this one section, see if I can remove some of this noise. Alright, so you can see there a little bit of that noise is removed. If I take that off, you can see how it's much more noisy here than it is here. At the expense of time, I've just taken a small section there to do it very quickly, and it's a very simple material, but that's basically how you would change this. I will improve or increase my maximum subdivisions and this subdivision multiplier here. Again, it's something which I will talk about probably at another time. So I probably won't talk much more about this at the moment. I've given you quite a lot of information in there, and it's probably going to be quite hard for you to take in if you're quite new to rendering. What I will say, I was only planning to talk for a few minutes, and I've clearly talked for too long, like I always do when I start yabbering. But what I would like you to do, if you're quite new to this, is just set up a simple scene like this. Go into the material editor for now and just open these, just a standard material, and go through some of these different settings and re-render over and over again to check what they actually do, right? Just to get some idea before the next lesson if you can. Also, what did I want you to do? Oh yeah, please take a look at these two and play around with, in particular, these subdivisions here. I tend to use it between 1 and 8 for drafts, and the threshold I'll put at 0.06. There we go. And I will put this at 0.5 for drafts. And if anything that you increase over that will increase render time and quality. Again, I'll explain exactly what they do in another lesson. Also, turn it on and off the GI and see what that does. And please have a look at these render elements, okay? And I'll show you how to use these to more effect next time. And okay, I should shut up. I've talked for too long today. So anyway, you guys, good luck with this. Any comments that you want to leave, or any questions, you can just email me or leave some comments below and I'll get back to you. I'm assuming you'll probably have a lot of questions. This was quite a difficult lesson to explain and quite confusing. So any questions you have, just put them down there and I will certainly make sure I address them in the upcoming lessons. And you guys take care. All right, bye-bye.